I remember the exact weight of my own leg the first time she touched it, because it was the first time in 3 days I'd let anyone touch it without swearing at them. They'd brought me into Harrow on a litter with the femur gone at an angle a femur should never go, and I'd spent 72 hours making the surgical tent regret my presence. I was a staff sergeant. I had 11 years and 4 deployments and a certain idea about what a man like me was for, and none of that idea included lying flat on a cot with my boot cut off, being tended like a colicky child by people I'd have called the rear. That word carried a lot of freight for me back then. The rear. The soft country behind the line where the wounded went to heal, and the cooks made the coffee, and the clerks stamped the forms, and nobody, as I understood it, had ever held anything against anything. The tent was long and dim and smelled of iodine and canvas and the particular copper of men who'd bled recently. 12 cots down each side, a plywood floor that flexed when the generators kicked, a surgical bay curtained off at the far end where the major did his cutting. Outside, the Kesh Valley climbed away in terraces of gray rock toward a sky that was never quite blue, and Fob Harrow sat in the fold of it like a coin dropped in a crack. A company outpost, a wire perimeter, a landing zone scraped flat, and this hospital tent that served every unit for 40 kilometers because there was nowhere else within a helicopter's patience to bring the broken. She ran the ward at night. I'd noticed her the way you notice furniture, a shape that moved through the dim between the cots, checking drips, reading charts by a red lens so as not to wake the sleeping, saying low, even things to men who woke up screaming and easing them back down. A nurse. Middle 30s maybe, though the valley aged everyone. Brown hair pulled back hard and flat. A plain uniform blouse, sleeves down, the kind of unremarkable competence you stop seeing after an hour. She had a name tape that said ELLISON, and a way of moving that I clocked without crediting, economical, quiet, her weight always over the balls of her feet, and I filed it under nurse and thought no more of it, because I had a shattered leg and a great deal of contempt, and both of those things take up room. "You're due for your antibiotic," she told me that first night, and I told her what she could do with her antibiotic, and she gave it to me anyway cleanly without a flinch or a lecture, and moved on to the next man. I decided she was the aspirin. That's what I called her to the 2 infantry privates in the cots beside me, boys from my own company laid up with frag and a bad ankle. The aspirin. Because that, I said, was the sum of what this place amounted to: aspirin and clean sheets and people who'd spent the war handing out both. The privates laughed because I was their sergeant and it was easier to laugh. She was 6 feet away. She heard it. She didn't turn around. I want to be honest about that because I've had a long time to sit with it since. It wasn't that I was ignorant of what nurses did. I'd been sewn up before. I knew a good medic was worth his weight in ammunition, and I'd have died more than once without one. But somewhere in me was a hard little ledger, and on that ledger the world divided into 2 columns, and the first column was men who went out past the wire and closed with the enemy and carried the fight in their 2 hands, and the second column was everyone else, and I believed, the way you believe a thing you've never once said out loud until it's tested, that the first column was the only one that had ever truly held a line. The nurse belonged in the second column. She belonged there so completely that when the evidence began to arrive, I didn't even see it. That's the thing about a ledger like that. It doesn't just decide what you think. It decides what you're able to notice. Here is the first thing I failed to notice. The second morning, one of the walking wounded, a feverdom kid off the line with a hand wound, had a pistol on him that he shouldn't have had, and in his sleep his hand found it, and he came half up off the cot with it out and shaking and pointed at nothing, at the whole tent, the way a frightened man will. 12 helpless men on their backs and a loaded weapon swinging over them in a shaking fist. I saw it and my gut dropped, because I knew from the length of the tent and the angle and my own broken leg, that there was not one thing in the world I could do about it. She crossed the plywood without hurrying and without a sound. She didn't grab for the gun. She put her open hand flat over the top of the slide and pressed it down and to the side, off of everyone in one motion. And she said the boy's name in a voice I could barely hear, and she kept her hand there until his hand loosened. And then the pistol was simply in her hand, and then it was cleared. The mag out, the round out of the chamber, the slide locked back quicker than I could have done it two-handed and healthy. And she set it out of his reach and went back to holding his wrist and telling him he was safe. 30 seconds, start to finish. The whole tent had held its breath. I let mine out and told myself she'd gotten lucky, and that the boy hadn't really meant it, and that anyone would have done the same. All three of those things were false, and I believed them anyway, because the ledger required it. I'd get one more lesson before the ledger burned, and I'd get it the same way, set right in front of me, and me too certain to read it. It was the rifle that should have told me. Day 3 afternoon, a resupply bird came in hot and dumped a load of casualties from a contact up valley, and for 2 hours the tent was a red machine. The major cutting, the corpseman running, the aspirin, as I still called her in the privacy of my skull, moving through all of it with a stillness that never once became slowness. In the chaos, a wounded man's rifle got left leaning against the tent pole 3 feet from my cot, muzzle up. A round of good ammunition in a weapon nobody was minding, and I lay there watching it and gnawing on my own uselessness, because I couldn't reach it, and the thought of an accidental discharge in a tent full of men on their backs was making my hands sweat. She noticed it on a pass, she stopped, and she picked it up. I opened my mouth to tell her to be careful. I actually said it, "Careful, sweetheart, that's loaded," and one of my privates snorted, and I heard myself, and I didn't care. And while I was saying it, she rolled the weapon into her shoulder, dropped the mag into her palm, cleared the chamber, caught the ejected round out of the air, thumbed the round back into the mag, checked the chamber was empty with a look and not a hope, and set the whole thing down safe against the pole with the bolt to the rear. She did it without appearing to think about it, the way you'd cap a pen. She did it in the time it took me to finish my sentence. And then she looked at me, the first time she'd looked directly at me since I'd named her the aspirin, and there was nothing in her face. No heat. No, I heard that. Just a level, patient, unhurried steadiness, the look of someone who has been underestimated so many times that it has stopped being an event and become weather. "It's clear now," she said. "You can stop worrying." "You handle it like you've held one before," I said. I meant it as a needle. She could hear that I meant it as a needle. "I've held a few," she said, and she moved on down the ward, and my private, God help him, said, "Bet you have, nurse," in a way that made the other one laugh, and she didn't turn around for that either. I lay there and something itched at the back of my ledger. The way she'd caught that round out of the air, the way her feet had settled, the way she'd cleared the pistol the day before, the way she checked the tent every time she came in the flap, her eyes going first to the corners, then the exits, then the men, always in that order, and I almost turned the itch into a question. But I was a staff sergeant with a shattered leg and 11 years of certainty, and I put the itch away. There is a kind of pride that is really just laziness wearing a uniform. I'd worn mine so long I'd stopped feeling the weight of it. That evening she changed the dressing on my leg for the first time. She did it with a gentleness that had steel underneath it, no wasted motion, telling me plainly what she was going to do before she did it so nothing surprised the wound. Up close I could see she had a scar that ran along the outside of her forearm, old and white and clean, the kind you get from something that was trying hard to kill you and nearly did. I could see her hands, and her hands were a puzzle I chose not to solve. The nails cut to nothing. A callus along the trigger finger side that no amount of nursing puts there. A tremor-free steadiness that most surgeons would trade a year of pay for. "How'd you get the arm?" I said, nodding at the scar because I was bored and mean and healing. "A long time ago," she said, "in a different job." "What job's that?" She taped the dressing down and smoothed it with her thumb and looked at the wound and not at me. "One I was good at," she said, and that was all, and I told myself it was a nurse being cagey about some kitchen accident, and I closed my eyes, and I did not understand that I had just been told the truth in the plainest words she had. The major came by after doing his rounds, a compact, exhausted man named Pell with reading glasses shoved up on his forehead, and blood dried brown in the creases of his knuckles. He was a fine surgeon and no fool, but he had his own version of my ledger. He treated Ellison as capable hands, a good ward nurse, a steady presence on the night shift, and no more than that, and it never occurred to him to wonder, any more than it occurred to me, why a trauma nurse checked the sightlines of a tent the way an infantryman checks a tree line. "She giving you grief, Staff Sergeant?" Pell asked, meaning it lightly, meaning her. "Just the opposite, sir," I said, quiet as a mouse. I have wished since that I could take those particular words back. Not because they were cruel, because they were so completely, catastrophically wrong, and because in about 30 hours every man in that tent, myself first, was going to learn exactly how wrong, and some of us were going to owe her our lives for the privilege of finding out. The shooters left the next afternoon. There'd been chatter for a week about a fighting column moving down out of the high passes. A hard, disciplined bunch, not the potshot amateurs we usually traded with. A couple hundred strong by the estimates, well led and moving with purpose toward the district center. Command wanted them intercepted up valley before they reached the towns, and Harrow was the closest boot, so the company saddled up. 2 platoons in the weapons section, and most of the QRF, trucks and gun jeeps grinding out the north gate in a rooster tail of dust, while the rest of us watched from wherever we were pinned. It was the whole muscle of the outpost, gone up the valley to close with the enemy in the honest way, in the way I understood, in the way that filled the first column of my ledger. What it left behind was a skeleton. A handful of gate guards, a mortar crew, a commo shack with 2 men, a cook, the surgical tent, Pell, 3 corpsmen, 2 nurses, and 20-odd casualties, half of us unable to walk, and her. It left a hospital full of men who could not run, guarded by a wire fence and a promise, in a valley where a couple hundred armed men were somewhere in the dark. And it left all of that under the thinnest crust of security you can imagine, because everyone with a rifle and 2 working legs had gone up the valley to fight the war in the place the war was supposed to be. I lay on my cot that afternoon and did the math the way an infantryman does it without wanting to, and I didn't like the sum. I said as much to Pell when he passed. "They wouldn't hit a hospital," he said, but he said it the way you say a thing you're hopping into being true. "They'd hit the outpost," I said. "The hospital's just where the outpost keeps the men it can't afford to lose. Somebody who knew the ground would know that." I hated saying it. It made the walls of the tent feel like paper, which they were. Ellison was 2 cots down, retapping a Marine's shoulder. A big quiet gunnery sergeant named Akaffer, laid up with a chest full of frag and a lung they'd reinflated, drifting in and out on the good drugs. She didn't look up from her work, but she said into the middle of the tent in that same low, even voice, "The north wire's the weak point. The ground rises to it. A man coming down that slope in the dark is above the guard and behind the light." A pause, the tape smoothing. "If it was me, that's where I'd come." Pell looked at her the way you'd look at the coffee if it started giving you tactical advice. "That's a grim thing to have worked out, Lieutenant." "It's just terrain," she said. "You read it once, you can't stop reading it." "And where'd you learn to read terrain?" I said, and I meant it as a needle again, because apparently I could not help myself, because 11 years of the ledger had worn a groove in me that deep. She looked at me then, that level weather look, and for the first time I thought I saw something move behind it, far back, like a fish under ice. "Same job as the arm," she said, and went back to Akaffer's shoulder, and I lay there in the failing light with the itch back and stronger and my pride sitting on top of it. And outside the tent the valley went the deep bruised purple it went before full dark, and somewhere up in the folds of it 200 men were moving, and I did not know, none of us knew, that they had already split, and that half of them were not up the valley at all. The generators dropped to night power. The red lamps came on. Ellison started her rounds. And the last easy hours any of us would have began to run out like water through a hand. I didn't sleep. The leg wouldn't let me, and the math wouldn't let me. And there's a thing that happens in an infantryman's spine when a place is about to go bad, a pressure, a wrongness you feel before you can name. And I'd learned across 4 deployments to trust it. And it was screaming at me, and I could do absolutely nothing with it but lie on my back and stare at the canvas and listen. So I heard the dogs stop. There were pariah dogs that lived along the wire and barked at everything, at the wind, at the moon, all night every night, a nuisance you learned to sleep through. Around 2 in the morning they barked hard at the north end, a rising ragged chorus, and then they stopped, all at once. The way dogs stop when the thing they're barking at comes close enough to be worse than barking about. I lay very still and listened to the silence where the dogs had been. Then a sound I knew in my bones, the flat, muffled, unmistakable cough of a suppressed weapon twice from the direction of the north wire. Not loud, almost polite, the sound of a sentry being taken off the board without the base ever waking up. I was already trying to sit, uselessly, hauling at my own dead leg, my mouth open to shout when the whole night tore open. The north gate lit up. A machine gun opened on the guard post and small arms behind it, a lot of them disciplined in controlled bursts, and I heard the particular sound of a wire being blown and the flat thump of an RPG going into the commo shack, and the outpost's thin skeleton of a defense came apart in about the time it takes to describe it. They'd come exactly where she'd said they'd come. Down the north slope, above the light, behind the guard. Somebody who knew the ground. The tent went to chaos. Men who couldn't run tried to run. A corpsman was shouting. Pell came out of the surgical bay half into his gear, yelling for someone to get on the radio, and the radio was gone. The shack was burning. The whole muscle of the outpost was 20 minutes up the valley with its back to us. 20-odd wounded men, and a handful of medical staff, and a valley full of disciplined killers who had planned this to the minute. And every one of us understood in the same breath that no help was coming in time, and that the only thing between us and the men now coming through our wire was the canvas of a hospital tent. And in the middle of all of it, while grown men froze, I watched the aspirin become someone else. She didn't flinch and she didn't shout. She crossed to the tent's main light and killed it, and then the second bank, dropping the ward into red and then into dark. And I understood a half-second later why a lit tent against the night is a paper lantern with silhouettes painted on it, and she'd just taken away the enemy's easy targets, which were us. Then she was moving down the ward, low and fast, and her voice came out of the dark flat and carrying and absolutely without fear, the voice of someone who has done this before, giving orders that were already right. Everyone who can move off the cots onto the floor to the surgical end now. Ambulatory, help a litter man each. Doc, get your people to the back wall behind the generator housing. It's the only steel in here. Nobody stands up. Nobody frames themselves in the flap. A pause, and I heard her by Akafer's cot. Heard the big Marine's weapon come up out from under the litter where a Marine's weapon always is. Heard her check it by feel in the dark. The mag, the chamber, the same 3 motions I'd watched her do in daylight and mistaken for a parlor trick. Coleman, my name, out of the black level. You can't walk, but you've got hands. I'm putting you at the generator housing with the mags. When I call, you feed me. Can you do that? It wasn't really a question, and God knows I didn't deserve for it to be. I said yes. Then start crawling, she said. And outside the last of the gate guards' fire guttered out, and Boots came across the LZ toward the tent in the dark, moving in the spread, unhurried way of men who believe there is nothing left in here that can hurt them. And the woman I had called the aspirin settled into the shadow beside the tent flap with a dead man's rifle in her hands and became, before my eyes, the thing my whole ledger had sworn did not exist. The first man through the flap died, without knowing a woman had killed him. I was on the floor by then, dragging myself the last few feet to the generator housing with my ruined leg trailing, and from there I had a low angle on the whole length of the ward and on the pale rectangle of the entrance, and I saw it the way you see a single frame of something too fast to follow. The flap swept aside. A shape came through it fast and low, rifle up, a professional's entry clearing left. And out of the dark on the right, the side he'd cleared second because you always clear one side a half beat before the other, came two flat cracks, close together, and the shape folded and dropped and did not move, and the rifle clattered on the plywood, and Ellison was already not where she'd fired from. That was the first thing I learned about how she worked, lying there in the dark with a canvas sack of loaded magazines she'd shoved into my chest. She never fired twice from the same place. The muzzle flash tells a trained enemy exactly where you are, and she knew it, so between every engagement she moved 2 steps, a shift of the shoulder into a new fold of shadow behind a cot or a crate, so that the fire coming back at her hit where she'd been. In the first 60 seconds, I watched her fire from 4 positions, and I watched the enemy pour return fire into 4 patches of empty canvas, and I began to understand that I had spent 3 days making jokes at a professional. 2 more came through together, having heard their man fall, coming through the way you're taught, 1 high, 1 low, and they were good, but the ward was black and it was hers, and they were framed for 1 instant against the paler dark outside the flap, and that instant was all she used. 2 controlled pairs, low in the chest where the plate is thinnest at the seam, the sound of it swallowed by the shooting still going on outside. 1 dropped in the entrance. The other made it 2 steps and went down across a cot, and the man in that cot, a private with both legs in splints, screamed and then clamped it down because she'd told them all in that flat carrying voice, "Be silent, be still. The dark is ours, not theirs." And they believed her the way you believe the one calm person in a room that's on fire. Coleman Mag. I had it in her hand before I decided to move. She swapped it in the dark by feel, the empty one dropping to my lap, and she was gone again, 2 steps left, low, and I lay there with my heart going like a hammer, and did the only thing I was good for now, which was reload the empty magazines from the loose rounds in the sack, my fingers finding the rhythm my hands had known for 11 years, and for the first time in 3 days I was useful, and it had taken a nurse to make me so. They stopped coming through the flap after the 4th body. They weren't fools. They'd lost 4 men to a black hole that was supposed to be a hospital full of cripples, and now they did what disciplined men do. They pulled back to the sides and they started to work the tent itself. And this is where I understood how badly they'd underestimated the ground, because they thought canvas was cover, and she knew it was only concealment. Fire started coming through the walls. They'd spread along both long sides and they raked the tent low, at cot height, working to kill by volume what they couldn't kill by entry, and rounds came through the canvas like it was smoke, snapping down the length of the ward, and every one of them went over us, because she'd put us on the floor behind the one steel thing in the building, and she'd put us there 4 minutes ago, before the first man ever came through, because she'd read where this was going the moment the light bank went out. Men who'd have been cut to pieces in their cots were pressed to the plywood behind the generator housing, breathing, alive, because the aspirin had known what was coming and moved us in the dark. She was down there with us now, back to the steel, and in a lull she did something that rearranged my understanding of her for good. She set the rifle across her knees, turned to the private nearest her, the one whose cot the dead man had fallen across, who was shaking, took his face in both her hands for 1 second, said something low I couldn't hear, and then reached past him and reclamped a pressure dressing on his thigh that had worked loose in the panic, seating it, checking it, her hands doing the nurse's work in the middle of the gunfight without her attention ever leaving the walls of the tent, treating and fighting, the same hands. She'd never put the one down to pick up the other, she just carried both. "They'll try the back next," she said to Pell, to all of us, calm as a woman reading a weather report. "They know the front's a kill box now. They'll come through the surgical end where they think the wounded are stacked and helpless. Doc, I need your 2 biggest corpsmen, and I need that surgical table on its side across the aisle now, while they're regrouping. We're going to make them a wall they have to come around one at a time. And they did it. Under fire in the dark, they tipped the heavy field table and dragged the oxygen cart and a pallet of saline against it, and built her a barricade across the throat of the ward, a redoubt, though I didn't have the word for it yet, a choke point where the tent narrowed toward the surgical bay, so that anyone coming from the back had to funnel through a single gap. And she set herself at an angle to that gap in the deep shadow, and she waited, and I fed her fresh magazines, and I finally understood what I was looking at. She wasn't lucky. She wasn't wild. Every single thing she'd done since the light went out had been a decision made 3 moves ahead: kill the lights, floor the wounded behind the steel, make the front a kill box, refuse to fire twice from one spot, and now channel them into a gap of her choosing where the dark and the angle and her hands all belonged to her. This was not a nurse who happened to shoot. This was a professional who happened, tonight, to also be the only thing standing between 24 helpless men and the people coming to kill them, and who was doing both jobs at once because she was the only one who could. The back of the tent moved, a seam parted. A shape came through into the surgical bay, and then a second, and they came fast toward the narrow gap she'd built. And she let the first one fully into the choke before she fired, so that his body fell in the gap and made the ground worse for the second. And the second stumbled, and she took him against the tipped table. And a third put a long burst through the canvas where her flash had been and hit nothing but the place she'd already left. And Akafar's rifle spoke once more from 2 feet to the side, and the third man went down. And then it was quiet in the tent again, except for the ringing and the breathing. And outside, the shooting starting to change its character in a way an infantryman's ear catches before his mind does. "That's the last of the entry team," she said, and I believed her, though I couldn't have told you how she knew. "The rest are outside deciding whether we're worth it. Coleman, how many mags left?" 6, I said. My voice came out steady, which surprised me. 6 full, I'm loading loose. "Load fast," she said, and then, into the dark, to the whole ward full of men who'd spent the last 10 minutes learning they were not going to die tonight. She said the thing I have carried with me every day since. "Nobody in here is getting left. Not one of you. That's not how this goes." And a voice answered her. Weak, drug-slurred, from the cot where the big gunnery sergeant lay with his reinflated lung, Akafar, surfacing up out of the morphine at the sound of gunfire the way old soldiers do, his eyes finding her in the red dark, his cracked voice full of something I didn't understand yet, something like awe. "Redoubt," he said. "That's you, you're Redoubt." She didn't answer him, but in the dark, feeding her another magazine, I felt the name land on me like a hand, because I'd heard it before. Everyone in the valley had heard it before. The way you hear a legend third hand and never think to attach it to a face. The call sign of a scout sniper section leader from years back in 2 valleys over. The one who'd held a collapsed strongpoint with a handful of wounded for a day and a night until relief cut through. The one they told the story about in the Chow line. The one I'd assumed, the way you assume, was a man. I lay on the plywood floor of a hospital tent with her spent brass warm against my hand, and I understood, all at once and far too late, exactly who had been changing my dressings. I need to tell the next part carefully, because it's the part where I stopped being a witness to her and became, for a few minutes, her hands, and because it's the part I'm least proud of and most grateful for, both at once. The lull outside broke wrong. The shooting picked back up, but it moved, swinging around toward the LZ side, and I heard the note of it change, and I said, without thinking, out of 11 years of reflex, "They're massing on the west side. They're going to rush the whole west wall at once and overwhelm the volume. You can't be in 4 places." "No," she agreed, already moving to the west side of the redoubt. "I can't." She said it flatly, no fear in it, just arithmetic. "So I need to make each shot worth 3, which means I need to not be reloading when they come." She glanced back at me in the dark, a fast read, taking my measure the way she'd taken the terrains. "You said 6 mags. You're loading loose. How fast can you get a mag to my offhand without me asking? Fast, I said. Then that's your job, and it's the most important one in this tent, she said, and I'm sorry it took a war for anyone to give it to you. And she turned back to the wall, and I want to be clear that she did not say that to wound me. She said it as a fact, the way she said everything, and it went through me cleaner than any round that came through that canvas, because it was true, and because she had every right to say worse and chose instead to hand me a purpose. Then they came. The west wall came apart under fire and men came through it in a rush, more than I could count, and the tent filled with the roar of it, and she went to work in a way I have never seen before or since and don't expect to again. She fired and moved, and I stopped trying to watch her and started only watching her offhand, because that hand was the whole of my world now. When it dropped an empty and opened, I slapped a full mag into it, and she seated it without looking and fired again, and the rhythm of it was the rhythm of two people who'd trained together for years, except we'd known each other for 3 days and hated each other for most of them. Empty, full, empty, full. I loaded loose rounds into the empties with fingers I couldn't feel, and I lost count of the bodies. And once a man got past her flash and came around the redoubt with his rifle swinging toward the wounded, and Akafar shot him from his cot with the last of his strength and then went under again. And once the fire got so close that a round furrowed the top of the generator housing 6 inches over my head and filled my eyes with paint chips, and through all of it her offhand kept coming back to me, open. Patient, certain I'd be there, and I was there every time, because a woman I'd called the aspirin had decided I was worth trusting with the one thing that mattered. It couldn't have lasted more than 4 minutes. It felt like a season, and it broke the way a rush breaks when it costs too much, not all at once but in a sudden thinning, the fire slackening, the shapes at the wall pulling back and not being replaced, the attack losing its nerve against a black tent that would not fall and kept killing the men who entered it. She fired twice more at the retreating dark, and then she did not fire again, and she stayed down behind the redoubt with the rifle up and her breathing slow and even, and we all lay in the ringing quiet and listened to the enemy decide we were not worth what we were costing. Reloading, she said quietly, and I put my last 2 full mags in her hand, and she topped the rifle and set the spares in her lap, and only then, in the dark, did I hear her let out one long breath, the first sign in the whole fight that she was a human being with lungs and not a mechanism. And that's when I heard it, the thing I'd been praying for and had stopped believing in, far off up the valley over the ridge rotors. And under the rotors, coming fast down the road, the grind of trucks and the long hammering of a heavy machine gun on a gun jeep, our gun jeep, the muscle of the outpost turning around and coming back down the valley at last, the company that had gone up to fight the war in the honest place arriving to find the war had come here, to the hospital, to the second column of my ledger, and been held. Held by a nurse. The relief came through the wire hard and fast, and found the fight already over. I'll never forget the way they came into that tent, because I saw it from the floor, from her feet, where I'd spent the worst and best minutes of my life. First a light, a white searchlight beam swinging in through the ruined flap, and voices calling out unit and challenge, and Pell shouting the countersign in a cracked voice from the surgical end, and then men pouring in, my men, the company's point element, rifles up, ready for a slaughter and stopping. Just stopping. Because their lights swept a hospital tent that should by every rule of war have been a charnel house of murdered wounded, and instead found 20-odd men alive on the floor behind a barricade, and a scatter of enemy dead in the entrance and the aisle and across the tipped surgical table, and one woman in a blood-stained nurse's blouse kneeling in the dark with a dead Marine's rifle across her knees, looking up into their lights with a face that held no triumph in it at all, only tiredness, and a kind of quiet. The company commander came through them, Captain Reyes, a good officer breathing hard, his eyes going around the tent, and doing the same arithmetic I'd done, and arriving, I watched him arrive, at the same impossible sum. He looked at the bodies. He looked at the barricade, at the kill box at the front, at the angle of it all, the professional shape of a defense built out of surgical furniture in the dark by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. He looked at Pell, who could only shake his head and point, and then he looked at her. "Who ran this?" Reyes said. He meant the defense. He was looking for the man he assumed had done it, some infantry NCO among the wounded who'd taken charge, someone from the first column. His eyes actually passed over her to look for that man. I watched them pass over her. "She did, sir," I said from the floor. I said it loud. I said it so the whole tent heard it, all of them, the point element and the captain and the corpsman and my two privates who'd laughed when I named her the aspirin, and who were now looking at her the way you look at something you've read about and never believed was real. "Staff Sergeant Coleman, sir. 1st Platoon. I watched the whole thing from right here." My voice was doing something I didn't expect it to do. "She killed the lights and put us on the floor behind the steel before they ever breached. She made the front a kill box. She built that barricade. She held the west wall alone when they rushed it. She never fired twice from the same spot, and she treated a man's leg in the middle of it. She held this tent, sir. With respect, I have been doing this 11 years and I could not have held this tent, and she held it, and she did it while she was also the only thing keeping the wounded alive." I ran out of air. It was her, all of it was her. The tent was silent, the kind of silence she made, the kind that has weight. Reyes looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at her name tape, ELLISON, and something moved in his face, some connection reaching for its socket, and Akafar's voice came up again from his cot, stronger now, steadied by the presence of his own people, and he gave the captain the last piece. "Sir," Akafar said, "that's Redoubt, scout snipers. She held the strongpoint at Vashel Ridge. I was there. I was a boy and she held that ridge with 9 wounded for a day and a night, and I have been telling that story for 6 years and I never once got to say thank you." His voice cracked on the last of it. "That's her, sir. That's Redoubt." I watched it go around the tent. I watched it reach the men who'd carried her chart as a nurse and the men who'd assumed, like Reyes, like me, that the hands that held the line were always a man's hands. I watched Major Pell's face as it landed on him, Pell, who'd called her capable and steady and no more, who'd said lieutenant to her as a courtesy and never once wondered, and I watched him understand that a section-leading combat veteran, a legend 2 valleys over, had been quietly running his night shift and clearing pistols out of feverish boys' hands and tapping shoulders, and had never, not once, said a word about who she was, because she didn't need us to know. That's the part that undid me. She'd have let us go on calling her the aspirin forever if the wire hadn't been cut. Reyes came to a kind of attention I've only seen a few times, the kind that isn't in any manual, and he didn't salute her, not there, not in a tent full of the wounded with the enemy maybe still on the ridge. He was too good an officer for theater. He just said quietly, so it carried anyway, "Ma'am, on behalf of every man in this tent." And he couldn't finish it, and he didn't have to. She stood up. It cost her something to stand. I saw it. She set the rifle down carefully against the tipped table, muzzle safe, the way she'd shown me a dead man's rifle should always be set, and she looked around at all of us, at the captain, at the point element, at Pell, at the men on the floor she'd kept alive, at me, and there was still no triumph in her. There was almost an apology, as if she were sorry we'd had to find out this way, sorry the quiet was over. "The credit's not mine," she said. "It's theirs." She nodded down at the wounded on the floor, at the men who'd stayed silent and still in the dark on her word. They did the hardest thing there is. They lay still and trusted somebody else to hold the line for them. You want to salute somebody, salute the men who didn't panic. A beat. And check the ridge before you stand anybody up in a lit doorway. This isn't over just because it's quiet. It was the most words I'd heard her say at once. And it was, I realized, exactly the kind of thing a section leader says when the fight breaks: deflect the credit, praise the men, and remind everyone the enemy gets a vote. She'd never stopped being who she was. She'd just been waiting for 6 years and 3 days in a nurse's blouse, for the night the second column had to hold, so she could quietly prove it always could. They cleared the ridge before they stood anyone up. Of course they did. She'd told them to. For the next hour, the tent belonged to the medicine again. The fight was over, but the wounded were not, and the enemy's rush had made new casualties out of the relief force, and out of two of our own men on the floor who'd caught the fire that came low through the walls, and Major Pell went back into the surgical bay with his hands and his exhaustion. And Ellison, I could not call her the aspirin anymore. The word had died in my mouth forever. Ellison put the rifle down and picked the other thing back up without any ceremony at all. The way you'd shift a weight from one shoulder to the other. I watched her do it. That was the thing I could not stop watching. 90 seconds after she'd held the west wall alone, she was kneeling over the private whose dressing she'd reclamped mid-firefight, checking the thigh again in the light now. Her voice gone soft, telling him he'd done well, he'd been so still. She was proud of him. And he was a 19-year-old kid who just watched a woman kill a room full of men to keep him alive. And he cried, and she let him, and held his hand while he did, and never once made him feel less for it. The same hands that had done the killing did that. She never put the one down to pick up the other. I keep saying it because I keep needing to believe it, that a person can carry both those things at once and not be broken by the carrying. She carried both. She was carrying both the whole time I was calling her furniture. I got my apology out around then. I'd been building up to it and it came out wrong, the way the true ones do. She'd come to check my leg, of course she had. It was on her ward, I was on her chart. The fight didn't change that. And she knelt by my cot in the returning light and peeled back the dressing to see if the crawling and the chaos had torn anything open. And her hands on my ruined leg were as gentle as they'd been the first night, gentler even. And I lay there and looked at the top of her bent head and said, "I called you the aspirin." "I know," she said. She didn't look up. She was checking the wound. "To your face, the first night, and I let my boys run with it. My voice was not doing well. I've been in this 11 years, and I looked right at you clearing a pistol out of a delirious kid's hand and catching a live round out of the air and reading the sightlines of this tent, and I decided you got lucky because you didn't fit in the... I had a way of dividing people, ma'am, and you didn't fit in the column I respected, so I decided the evidence was wrong instead of the column. That's what I did. I looked at proof, and I called it luck, because the alternative was admitting I was." "Coleman." She looked up then. That level weather look, but something warmer far back in it now, something that had thawed. "You crawled across a plywood floor on a shattered femur to feed me magazines under fire. You didn't miss once. You called the West Side Mass a full 3 seconds before I'd have seen it, and those 3 seconds are why I was reloaded when they came." She smoothed the fresh tape down with her thumb, the way she did. A man's ledger is his own business right up until the shooting starts. Then all that matters is whether he's where he says he'll be. You were where you said you'd be. She almost smiled. Almost. "The apology's accepted, and it isn't necessary, and if you tell anyone I let you off that easy, I'll deny it." I laughed. It hurt the leg, and I didn't care. It was the first clean thing I'd felt in 3 days. "How'd you end up here?" I asked her. "Redoubt, scout snipers. How does that become a night shift nurse in the worst hospital in the valley?" She was quiet for a moment, repacking her kit, and I thought she wouldn't answer. And then she did, in that plain, flat voice that I'd learned by then was the sound of her telling the exact truth and trusting you to be able to hear it. "I held a ridge once," she said. "Vachel. Akaffer was there, he was a boy, he told you. 9 wounded and me and a strongpoint that was supposed to fall, and we held it a day and a night until they cut through to us." Her hands went still on the kit. "We held it, but holding it meant I spent that whole day and night watching men bleed out that I couldn't reach, because the only thing keeping the rest of us alive was me on that rifle, and if I'd left the rifle to work on the dying, we'd all have died. So I lay there and I did the arithmetic and I let some men go so the rest could live, and it was the right call, and I'd make it again, and it is the worst thing I have ever carried." She looked up at me. "When it was over, I put in for a corpsman's course, then nursing, because I decided if I was going to be the one who did the arithmetic, who decided who the line could afford to lose, then by God I was going to also be the one who knew how to save the ones the arithmetic said we could keep. I didn't want to only be the hands that hold the line. I wanted to be the hands that put people back together too. So I learned. And I stopped telling people about the other thing because the other thing follows you, and I wanted the nursing to be clean of it. She stood, hitching the kit onto her shoulder. And then tonight, she said, for the first time in 6 years this ward needed both. So it got both. A pause. That's all this was, Coleman. It wasn't a secret and it wasn't a trick. It was just a woman who learned 2 jobs finally having to do them in the same hour. The birds came at first light and took the worst of us out, and I was on one of them. My leg finally splinted right, watching Fob Harrow drop away below through the open door. The wire cut in 3 places along the north slope exactly where she'd said it would be, the scorched shell of the camo shack. The surgical tent standing crooked and torn and unfallen in the fold of the valley like a coin that had refused to be spent. Akaffer was on the same bird stable, his lung holding. He caught my eye over the noise, and he didn't try to talk over the rotors. He just held my gaze and gave one slow nod, the nod of a man passing you something he's carried a long time, and I nodded back, and I understood that we'd both been led into the same thing, the 2 of us, 6 years apart, the thing of being a man who'd survived because Redoubt was there, and who now got to spend the rest of his life telling people about her, and never quite making them believe it, the way I'd never believed it in the Chow line. I've told the story a lot of times since. I always tell it the same way. And people always wait for the part where she breaks, where the nurse turns out to have been faking the softness, or the sniper turns out to have been faking the caring, where one of the 2 people she was cancels the other one out because that's the story we know how to hear. And I always have to tell them, no, that's not what happened, that's not what she was. She was both, the whole time, the whole night, and neither one was the mask. The hands that stopped the bleeding and the hands that stopped the men who made the bleeding were the same hands, and she never once had to choose between them because she'd spent 6 years making sure she'd never have to. She just carried both, all the way through, and she carried the rest of us on top of them. I had a ledger once, 2 columns, men who held the line and everyone else. I burned it on the floor of that tent, feeding magazines to a nurse, and I have never missed it, because I learned the thing it had kept me from learning for 11 years, and it's the only thing worth taking out of that valley, and it's this. The line doesn't care what column you thought you were in. The line only cares who's still standing on it when the dark comes through the wire. That night, in a hospital tent nobody up the valley thought worth defending, the one still standing was the one we'd all written off, the quiet one, the steady one, the one who'd learned 2 jobs so she could keep the promise she made on a ridge 6 years before, that nobody in her care would ever be left behind again. They didn't know their combat nurse was a Marine. Then the dark came through the wire, and she taught every one of us, the doubters, the wounded, the whole valley, exactly what a redoubt is. It isn't a wall or a tent or a barricade of surgical tables in the dark. It's the last thing that holds when everything in front of it has fallen. It's the position you build behind the line so that when the line breaks, there is still something the enemy cannot get past. She was ours. She'd been ours the whole time, standing there in a nurse's blouse with the sightlines memorized, waiting, quiet, for the night we'd need her to be more. And when we needed it, she was.